I think authors always know far more about their characters, about the scenario, than ever make it into the book because what you're trying to do is make it relevant. You are trying to keep that plot just running. Plot twists are great, but you have to keep the momentum and you have to keep the pacing to keep readers in the story.
Hello, and welcome to Most Writers Are Fans, the podcast that helps you on your writing journey. So something that has always sort of been a ongoing struggle for me is figuring out how to do research whenever I write fiction, because I'm a fantasy writer. But even when you're writing fantasy, there's a lot of times whenever you got to figure out how the thing you're writing is sort of like grounded in the world that we live in. And oftentimes the way that you do that is through research. So in this episode, I had the good fortune of talking to Lee Clark, who is the author of the Matthew Paine Mystery series. And she does extensive research on the stuff she does. And guys, mystery is one of those genres that research is invaluable whenever you dig into it. So she has a lot of things to tell me about, like how she learned about things like, forensic crime scene data or medical examinations, all kinds of ways that she's dug into research. And I think it's really interesting and also really helpful for anybody that's getting into writing.
I write mysteries, and there are a lot of things that I don't know about. Well, lots of things, but specifically forensics, or police procedurals, or that sort of thing. Weaponry, I've had to learn a lot about that. And so, in order to make the stories real and believable, I have done a lot of research. So the storyline is fiction, the characters are fictional, but even as far-fetched as some of these scenarios sound, I promise you they actually are legitimate. They actually could happen. They've been validated by the experts.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a fantasy author and I still do a ton of research for my stuff. I mean, because, horses exist in my fantasy world and horses exist in our world. So, there needs to be some accuracy in how I describe them, right? That's the thing that I have to keep in mind as I'm writing. And I think it's something that you don't always think about until you're writing it and you're like, wait a minute, I don't know anything about this thing that I designed my entire story around. Let me do a little bit of research here. So for you, whenever you're starting a novel, when does research sort of play into it? Do you know going into it, I've got to delve into this thing before I even start? Or does it sort of as you're going come up?
Some of both. So right now I'm getting ready to start a new series because Killer Convergence that just released this spring is the seventh and the final book in the Matthew Paine Mystery series. And the new series, I wanted a quirky main character, female, the strong, the type, the strong female that is a little bit quirky. And so I wanted to give her a profession that was very relevant to mysteries, but also something that's offbeat, something you wouldn't typically find a woman doing. So she's a medical examiner, which that's not all that uncommon. I consulted our North Carolina medical examiner, who is a woman, for one of my earlier novels, but she's also an entomologist. So entomologists study bugs, and then she applies that to the whole medical examiner profession to help determine, how long a body has been there and all that sort of thing. But guess what else I don't know a lot about? Bugs.
Yeah.
So I'm having to do a lot of research to create the character. I'm doing a little bit of traveling around right now because I want the perfect location for her to live. And so I move things around in the novels, but there's some factual foundation to all of them because I feel like what you don't want to do is take the reader out of the story, for any reason. One of those reasons could be you write something that there's an expert on the subject reading your book and they think, that could never happen. That's baloney. This person doesn't know what they're talking about, and they're out of the story. And they may or may not ever come back. So you don't want them to put your book down and walk away, even for 5 minutes, if you can help it. And so I think one of the ways to do that is to make the the scenarios and the descriptions of the places very real and very true and based on facts, especially for the scenarios and things that you're setting up. As a fantasy author, I think that's authoring a fantasy series would be harder, I think, because you have to create your whole world. I'm researching and writing characters and stories in an existing world, and I just think that's easier. I think you have a much harder time than I do.
I think that there's different kinds of challenging, if that makes sense. Because the thing about a fantasy novel that I think is kind of freeing is you can be like, and this happens, and it is magic, and it's fine. And you don't really have that ability in a more grounded series. But at the same time, like a lot of times the things you're building have to be based on real things because oftentimes you're sort of like combining real concepts to make something make sense, right? In a fantasy world or in a grounded series, you have to just know how it works. And I think you bring up an interesting thing there with having a character who's an entomologist because like the truth is whenever you have a profession like that, that's sort of a nerdy profession that you probably was drawn to, right? Because you probably really loved bugs from a young age. Oftentimes,
Exactly.
that's going to inform who you are and like how you talk and how you think. And it's something that as an author, you have to think about because the truth is, like, if you're not into bugs, like you don't think the way that they would think. So it is interesting to think about having to like I imagine you probably have to not just read like information about bugs, but also like interviews with entomologists, things like that to kind of like understand how they talk, how they think, that kind of thing.
Exactly. So a lot of that is happening right now as I'm getting ready to start this new series. And it should be a lot of fun just because there's a lot for me to learn and I enjoy learning. I mean, you just should never stop learning ever, whether you're writing books or flying airplanes or, you're a marine biologist, you never want to stop learning. So for me, that's part of the fun part. Part of it is the creativity, creating the characters and the scenarios, but part of it really is the learning process and, what kind of research do I need to do to make this real? And I can give you some examples from the original series. So, MIA was the third book in the series. I don't know. I guess for podcasts, you can't see the pretty
It's a
colors.
video podcast too, so
This for the video
yeah.
podcast, you have a little bit of an aid back here. These are my author copies of this first series. So I've got Roy G. Biv going back here, the whole rainbow electromagnetic spectrum across the book series. So yellow was MIA, which stands for missing in action, and it also happens to be the code to the Miami airport. There's a young woman that has gone down to work for the summer, and they're college aged. She and her teenage boyfriend leave one evening to pick up a pizza and they never come back. So I had to set up, and so that that particular scenario deals with human trafficking. I did a lot of research on that. It is far easier to traffic people into this country than it is to traffic them out. So I had to come up with a scenario that was workable, that really actually could happen. And I cringed a little bit when I did it because I thought, I don't want to be telling people how to do this. And so then I just went to the expert. I consulted a former NSA agent who specialized in human trafficking before he retired from NSA. And he validated the scenario. And when I expressed that concern to him, he said, "Oh, don't worry. I'm sure they're already doing it. That's a completely valid scenario. Yeah, that's a workable scenario." So that's just one example of how you set up a scenario. And it probably sounds kind of far-fetched, but it's not.
Yeah, I mean that's something you kind of learn as an author, right? Is like sometimes we have to Google like kind of gruesome things because when you're writing about murder or whatever, like you have to dig into it. And the thing you realize is I get what you're concerned because it's like I don't want to have like an instruction manual of how to do
Right,
this. But then
right.
also it's like, well, I guess if I can find this information, like literally anyone could also. So
Well,
it's like, well, I guess it's readily valuable. So like that doesn't need to be a huge concern.
some things aren't Googleable though. Some things aren't searchable. How's that? That's easier to say. Um, Hence the NSA agent. Some things are completely searchable. So like the fourth book, the middle one is a Christmas book, Christmas Punch, and in it there is poison. So I did a lot of research about different kinds of poison. That one actually does read like a how-to manual a little bit at points on how to avoid this particular poison that is regularly occurring in nature and how to recognize it and how to avoid it. The main character, does a little bit of a, okay, so this is not Queen Anne's lace. Here's the difference. Queen Anne's lace looks like this. Hemlock looks like this. Just you're better off to just avoid them. But anyway, so a little bit of the reverse there, where we do some education on how to avoid something that could be potentially very deadly very quickly.
Well, and that's a nice thing because then you feel good about putting that information out there, right? Because it's
Right.
like if my readers might actually save their own lives if they happen to run into this thing in the wild.
Or lives of their children, because
Yeah.
children, oh, pretty flower, and they're going to go pick it, and then you need to quickly get your child to the hospital if that happens. And if they start developing symptoms, it kind of explains what those are to know what they might potentially have gotten into and need to be treated from. And the main character does also happen to be a doctor, so he drops little bits of wisdom like that every now and then in the books in the series.
So I'm curious, sort of how you find or how you determine what direction to go in, because it sounds like you do a lot of interviewing with experts, which just sounds like is a really solid way to get information because it's from the source. What are other ways you could sort of like approach, or how do you know when that's the way to go, or whatever? Like you'd rather like look something up or find a book or find a video online. Like how do you sort of like determine that?
Really, it's whether or not that information is available. Okay, so fourth book in the series, the blue one, Iced. If you look at the cover of that one, it's not gruesome unless you know that you're looking at a dead body, and then okay, maybe it is a woman's face. That body was found frozen and dumped in a heated pool, and in the woman's back molar was lodged a black diamond. And they didn't know who she was or how she got there. Her fingertips had been frozen off. And so that scenario is really not searchable. You can't say, "Hey Google, how would a body, manifest in this situation? What does that tell you or not tell you about how long ago the person was killed, where they've been stored and how long?" I mean, all of the things that you can't search and find those answers. That's when you go to the expert. And so that was the North Carolina medical examiner, and her scenario for how that happened and what a body would be like under those circumstances and for how long became the main character's guess at what had happened and how. Because that's not searchable. So if it's searchable, I absolutely will do exhaustive searches and go do all the research. And I have had professionals a couple of times send me to books and say, "Go read this, and if you still have questions, come back. I'll be happy to help you." Because this most recent book, Killer Convergence, has a cold case that happened. It was a murder that had occurred 22 years before. And I don't know all that much about police files or how to go about, looking into a 22-year-old cold case. So I did consult a retired homicide detective, and he pointed me to a great book, which I read cover to cover and marked up and took copious notes. And then some of the things from that book made it into the fictional version. Like, after 22 years, if somebody has lied about something, sometimes they forget that and they will go back and tell the truth.
Yeah, the thing that I run into a lot that I get really stumped on research with is like people that kind of like no longer exist and trying to explore what that is like. Like I had a character who was indigenous coded, so like not indigenous, but like indigenous coded for the purposes of my fantasy book, and they ended up in a place that was sort of like South Asian, India, Pakistan coded, and they were eating food, and I was like, okay, so if somebody had ate only the food the Native Americans ate, and then they ate food from India, what would that person would they think it was spicy, or would there already be spices that they would have ate? And it's like, so I had to do a lot of digging into like what was Native American food, like what were they eating, how does that compare to Indian food, and it was like a project to like dig into this one scene, like this one like potentially comical scene of how this character reacts to eating this food, and but I think it's worth it because it's like I don't want to inaccurately portray this, right?
Right, right. So somebody who knew that information or, was of that indigenous people group you would take them out of the story because they would say, "Wait a minute, I don't think so." So, yeah, I can see even in fantasy how you would need to get things like that as accurate as possible.
Well, and something I'm curious about too is you mentioned medical examiner because we all sort of like are aware of that now. But I think the other reason why a lot of us are aware of it are from like TV shows and things, right? Like a lot of these crime procedurals. But the truth is, not all of them are accurate either, right? So like a lot of us maybe feel like we know what people do in their jobs, but it's maybe not. Maybe it's like exaggerated or dramatized in some way.
That's probably very true.
Do you ever try to lean on that stuff, like things that we feel like we know, or do you never trust your own senses whenever you dig into that kind of stuff?
Some of both. If it's something that I think I know, usually I go look up information about it. Another case in point is the other character in the series is a homicide detective, and so I've had to learn a lot about the police force and how that works. There is in North Carolina a downloadable like handbook for police procedurals, and I went and pulled it down because my specific question was, can a police officer carry his own personal weapon on the job? Turns out he can. And then what are the procedures around that? So, it still has to be cleaned and inspected and everything regularly as if it were belonging to the police department. And it, gets left in his locker, at the police precinct when he goes home. So there were a lot of things that I learned from that. Um, Once again, to make that very real. So there are things like that that I already know. There are things that I feel like writers take liberties with anyway, because you can't tie up the plot line
Yeah,
too badly to say, well, 2 weeks later,
right.
and
Slows down the tension.
yeah, that's probably why the TV shows do it too, because they could make 2 weeks transpire, but usually the cases get a little bit colder after that. So I understand why they do it, but I think you just have to be a little bit careful with it because, once again, there are people who know these things. And my husband works in a hospital. My daughter's a medical student. So anything that revolves around a hospital, both of them will call it out really fast. That's not right. That never happens. Do you see that? That could never happen. Um, so yeah, I think it makes a difference if you know what you're talking about, or if you go research to learn if somebody else knows better than you do what you're talking about.
Well, and two, I think it's interesting to think about that kind of thing, like things that take a lot longer than we imagine. Because I mean, there's plenty of movies and TV shows about like journalists like chasing down stories, but the truth is, like super investigative stories take like years to write, like literal years. And I think that that is an interesting story to kind of like follow, but then like you're missing so many gaps in their day to day, and it's like. Is it, do you need to just compress the timeline to make it more dramatic if you're going to make a movie about that or whatever? And I think it is something that the public just doesn't understand, that like that's how it works, and it is still interesting and dramatic, but you got to understand, like there's still life happening between
Right.
like these moments, you know.
And I think there are ways to do that cleanly. I mean, if you're maybe you're dividing your book into sections by timelines. Maybe you're dividing it by chapter and you're putting a date on the chapter heading so you can see, oh, well, this is actually 3 weeks later. And you
Yeah.
might get a little quick blurb on the thing that transpired in the interim that's important. So I think there are ways to do it, but I doubt very many people do. I don't know.
Well, and I bet a ton of investigators, like police investigators, will do like they're working multiple cases at the same time, right? So like they'll send in information for one case and they'll work another case for a while, and then that information comes later. Then they just have to shift gears to get into that case. But I think and I think that that would be an interest. I think you could write a mystery novel in that way if it's like a super noir, like many different plot threads that come together. I think that for sure could happen. You could make that compelling, but I also think that sometimes you want to sort of have a clean through line. And
Right.
to do that, like you really can't bounce from case to case, you know?
No, I think you're right about that. And I think those professionals that you're talking about get annoyed with us when we mess some of those things up. Like, for example, and I've done lots of seminars and things to try to learn some of this information. People in police enforcement get annoyed when writers call the thing that you load into the gun a clip. That's a magazine, not a clip. And that apparently really annoys them. So there's a list of them, and I have a running list somewhere that I just compiled to try to keep myself straight. Say this, don't say that. You will really annoy somebody if you say that instead of this other thing.
Yeah, but then it's also like, but everyone else calls it this. So like
Right,
I
right.
so it's like, will they understand it if call it something else?
True.
Yeah. It's a battle that I think we're constantly fighting. Is it like, do you want to appease the experts or do you want people to be able to understand your book easily? And oftentimes we veer towards the latter because we want more people to read our books.
You're right. You're absolutely right. And honestly, I think in a fantasy world, you can call it Fred if you want to, as long as you define it so
Right.
your readers know what you're talking about.
Yeah. If a cop says no, it's called a magazine, it's like not in this world.
Right. This world is called Fred, and here's how I defined Fred.
So something I'm also curious about because we've all read those books where they start delving into like a really specific subject and it like takes you out of the story almost because they really go
Right.
into detail about it. And then as an author, I'm like, oh, they clearly did a lot of research on this. They didn't want to waste that research by not telling the reader about it. How do you avoid doing that? Do you notice it when you're doing it, or do you sort of like pull yourself back? Or
If I do it, usually I catch it in an edit. So, like, if there's too much information, or sometimes it's too much detail at the wrong time. Sometimes it's front loading information that needs to come out in little bits and pieces throughout the book, but not be just kind of downloaded all at once. Usually I catch that in the edits if I do that. I think authors always know far more about their characters, about the scenario, than ever make it into the book because what you're trying to do is make it relevant. You are trying to keep that plot just running. You don't want plot twists are great, but you have to keep the momentum and you have to keep the pacing to keep readers in the story. And so I know exactly what you're talking about, where authors have studied a war, for example, and so they go off into this whole diatribe about all the things happening in the war that really are not relevant to the story. It's just that they've done all this research and they know it, and so they throw it in there. And I think it just takes the reader out of the story and it makes you just kind of like skip over it all. Okay, so let me get back to the plot line of what was happening between the characters and, in the story. So I know exactly what you're talking about. And for me, I have been known to do that. And usually I catch it when I'm editing and I just think, oh, that's too much detail right there. I either need to just take some of it out and leave it out, or I need to spread it out if it's relevant, but you don't want that much, just an information dump all at one time.
well, and I think my advice for authors when you do that is to just let yourself do it, like when you're drafting, because I think it's important to just get it out. Like obviously you need to get it out for whatever reason, so just get it all in there. And I think that's what good editors are for, right? Is they come in and they can point out those things because sometimes they'll say like, "Hey, this is important, but maybe move this detail into this part and this other detail into this other part," because you could roll them out more naturally in a way that makes more sense. So I think that it's important as an author to just sort of like let yourself do it and then just understand that you have to go back and change it later, you know?
True. Now, I go through and edit a couple of times before my content editor even gets it. And then after that, I'll go back through another edit. So I'm editing myself in between the line editor and the proofreading and the all of those. So yeah, I guess a content editor would be probably the one you're talking about who would catch that and say, "Hey, this is too much over here. Maybe if you move that," or, "Oh, I've even had my content editor say, 'Do you even need this chapter?'"
Yeah. Yeah. I usually have the opposite problem personally. I usually have the I've not said enough yet. So like they'll say things like, "What does this room look like?" And like I have the answers in my head. I just never thought I had to explain it to everyone else. So
Right.
then like
Yeah.
whenever they say it, it's like, "Oh, I guess I should probably write that in this chapter." So oftentimes that's what I run into more than too much. But no, I get it where it's like, hey, but I think that that's why editors are so good at their job, though, because a lot of times you need somebody that isn't you because you're too close to it and you can't see where, because you're like, hey, the readers need all this information because it's going to come up later. Whereas, like, a content editor can say, hey, take these two sentences and move it to this part where it's relevant and not all at once. Because I think that that's something that we can't always see as the author because we're just too close to
I
it.
would say we rarely see it as the author because we know what we meant to say. I mean, it's just like you saying, I know all these things in my head. I have all these understandings in my head. They just didn't make it onto the page. I usually have the opposite problem. But that's everybody needs an editor. I, I don't ever want to hear any writer tell me, I don't need an editor. Yes, you do. Everybody does. Even if you are an editor, you still need an editor because you know what you meant to say. And you don't always convey that in the best way because when you read it to edit yourself, you see and hear what you meant to say. You don't necessarily catch the holes or catch where there's too much exposition on something that didn't really need to be described to the nth level of detail,
Yeah.
And
And I think that I try to write to the kind of reader that I am. Like, I like reading
yeah.
things that don't give you too many details up front. So then whenever they do come up, they're a bit of a surprise or
Yeah.
you're learning it more naturally. Because, like I write in first person a ton and
Oh,
like
okay.
my characters wouldn't explain things that they know already. You know what I
Right,
mean?
exactly.
So like I don't like going into that kind of exposition unless it comes up because I don't think it's necessarily a thing that the character would do. And I think that it's something to keep in mind as you're writing too. And I think that that's maybe why I get in the habit of not doing enough because I try to keep things out until it comes up. And then it's like, well, maybe it did come up. So maybe I should actually explain it here.
Maybe it needed to come up over there because that's information that I need over here. So let me go back over
Yeah.
there and just write that in. Yeah, I've done that too. But I mean, writing mysteries, you have to do those sorts of things. So yeah, I
Yeah.
know
And I think that's
exactly what
just
you're
part of it,
talking
right?
about. It is. It's absolutely part of it.
So that's something else when you think about like organizing your research, organizing even like your own like information. Do you have like a Google Drive with multiple folders with different spreadsheets to kind of like organize everything, or how do you kind of think about that?
Busted. I do. I have one list of just characters, and that's across the whole series. And it helps me catch things like apparently I liked the name Nelson, first name, last name, tried to use it multiple times. But then I realized, oh, I've got a character with the first name of Nelson over here. I probably don't need two more with last names Nelson over there.
Yeah.
I mean, I might confuse my readers as they're reading through the series. I also have like a list of places because I rename things around. So this series is set around the Raleigh, North Carolina area. And Raleigh keeps its name, Durham keeps its name. Most of the rest of the little towns around it don't. They're renamed something else. I rename street names, and some of those are just to be funny. So, like, if you know the area, there's kind of an inside joke there. And if you don't, you're not missing anything. You just miss the inside joke. And I do have to keep track of all of those. What did I call that over here? Oh, that's right. I named that town this. And then things like timelines, especially for mysteries, I have to keep track of when did that happen? Who said that when? When did they learn this thing? Because it's relevant and important as you're twisting and winding that story and all of the details. And I can't keep track of it from start to finish if it takes me several months to write a first draft. And so I have another folder that just has timelines from across all of the books of what happened when.
Yeah, the thing you mentioned about naming things as like a joke for people who happen to know already, that's something that I've run into a lot. And I think it's sort of like the opposite of research, which is like you've worked a job or whatever, so you know a lot about a thing. So then you'll put a joke in there that maybe doesn't necessarily fit the world, but like it's fine because it's really just a joke for people who would know that. Like I made a joke about how like I was writing a short story and my main character was going to this like charity function and they were naming it something that wasn't like accurate to like the thing just because they wanted it to sound flashy or whatever. And my character commented on it and then gave a bit of exposition about the world. And I had an editor that was like, hey, he wouldn't explain this because everybody should know it. And it's like, that's not the point of it. That's not that's not why it's there. It's a joke for people who've worked in nonprofits and have seen this happen. That's what it is. It's not about this. And I think that that's something that also like if you work in the industry, like you know these things and you don't think that you forget that not everyone else knows them.
True. That's true. Coming out of the software industry, I don't think that there's enough exciting things in that industry to write about, honestly. But I do think that, like we were talking about before, timelines and things are more accurate when you sort of know what that would entail to go dig around and find that information, or to, even if you've got a search going across multiple servers in a cloud and they're all working on it at the same time, it's still going to take some time. So things like that in the real world play in, but that's not I don't think that the software industry is going to be in a mystery anytime real soon.
I don't know. I mean, there could be things embedded in software or whatever, right? They could be like
That's
clues to
true.
things. And I could see why if it's a thing that but you might think your readers know it because you know it so innately.
Oh, that's a good point.
That's a thing that I run into a lot is like I think the readers might know this, but they don't because they've not worked in the same fields that I have.
That's a really good point, and it is something to be careful of. Even the things that I've learned that I didn't know before. Like, for example, I mentioned that the main character in the Matthew Paine Mystery series, obviously Matthew Paine, is a doctor. And so he talks about EMRs sometimes, the patient record, the system that contains all the patient records and the patient records themselves. And so there are things like that on the first occurrence, particularly in each book, I'll try to explain what he's talking about. And then I'll give him some license to just kind of go off and talk about it. Once you've explained to your audience what is an EMR, that's the person's medical record that he's looking at to get whatever information that he wants or needs. But you can't just throw that in there even after it becomes a familiar term to you, even if it maybe didn't start out that way. You still have to be really aware of it and define it when you do.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to that whole like, am I writing for readers like me or am I writing for more casual readers?
Yeah.
Because like I read a lot of diverse literature and a lot of times I'll run into like cultural terms I don't know. And I get a lot of fulfillment out of like looking them up and like learning about this culture that I didn't know about, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like that's a cool experience. So I can see why like that kind of more actively engaged reader might appreciate you not explaining the term for them to have to look it up and then learn about the industry or whatever. But again, if you're writing a mystery novel that you're hoping like the masses will read, then you're hoping for more casual readers, right? So maybe they want to be spoon fed that information as opposed to like giving them homework.
Right. So I think there's a balance there between spoon feeding, beating them over the head. So I'm going to tell you once what this means, and I hope you
Yeah.
remember, because I'm not going to go back and redefine it five more times and spoon feed, beat over the head, however you want to define that. We don't need to overdo this, especially for the people who got it the first time. And maybe if they didn't, they just flip back and go look. But or look it up, as you say.
Yeah.
Google's right there in everybody's hands these days. So there is a healthy tension there. There's a balance there between making sure that you define things so that you don't take readers out of the story, because you say you're an active reader and you enjoy going and looking it up, and there's probably a good portion of readers who do that. But then there's some that just are not going to be bothered if it'll take them out of the story if they don't know what it means and it's pertinent that they understand it. It'll take them out of the story potentially if they go to look it up and then go down a bunny trail of all kinds of related searches and then they don't come back. And so I think there's a really healthy tension there, a balance between giving them too much information and they're like, oh, come on, I got it already, move on, versus not defining things.
Well, and I feel like this may be a pet peeve. I don't know if this is a pet peeve as a writer or as a reader, but like the truth is, if I don't know what a thing is after it's been explained to me, I just move on past it because the truth is, it's probably not relevant enough to the plot that I need to know everything about it. You know what I mean? And I feel like probably most readers feel that way too. Like you just kind of skim on past it and then connect enough to make it make sense to you so that the plot then makes sense again. I don't think that we need to explain. This maybe goes back to my problem with writing where I don't explain enough, but like, I don't think we need to explain every little thing. I think that it's
Mm.
sort of okay for readers to just kind of skim past because the truth is, a lot of us read as a hobby to to like pass the time. So like if you're reading a beach read, like you're not gonna stress about what does this mean if my phone's in the car. You're just gonna kind of keep reading and just hope it makes sense eventually.
Exactly. You hope it makes sense eventually. And sometimes, like, let's say you're reading a novel from a British author and they drop some term that you're not familiar with. It's the same thing. You hope the context around it is sufficient that you pick up what the meaning is and you're able to just keep reading. And if it was something that was, critically important to the plot, hopefully at some point they'll define it and you just
Yeah.
keep reading and wait for it.
Or the context, there'll be enough context that it makes sense.
Right.
Like if you're talking about a medical file or whatever, if they're referencing information that would be in a medical file, it stands to reason that that might be a
That's
medical
what they're
file.
looking at, right. Right.
So, I think it's one of those things where just give your readers a bit more credit, but then also like your readers are going to give us a lot more leeway, I think, than we think they will. Because I think that what we're worried about, like the reason that we do the research is we're worried about the people who are actually in the industry criticizing us more than anything, right? And also telling like more accurate stories than it is about like readers. Because the thing is, most readers are also fans of things like CIS and they don't care that it takes 2 minutes to get forensic results, like,
Yeah,
like
you're
they
right.
don't get pulled out because they
The
just don't
bulk of
care.
readers, you're probably right. They don't care. They might know, but they still don't care.
Yeah. Because it just isn't, it doesn't, this, I'm watching this for fun. I don't need to get bogged down in the details. I think that that's sort of like part of where I think that we as writers stress about it more than readers actually do.
Than they care. Yeah, we stress more than they care. Yeah, you're probably right.
Any last thoughts about research? Anything you would give authors as sort of like some final advice about research?
Um, I would say if you are writing about a specific profession or you have somebody in a specific profession, that's definitely the time to do your research and make sure your character knows what they should know. It doesn't always have to come out in the book, and a lot of times it doesn't. You realize that your characters have knowledge that they don't ever explain or talk about in the book, but it makes their actions and their reactions and what they say and how they say it more realistic and more relevant if you know the things that your character should know in whatever that profession is that they're in. So I would definitely say do that much research. And if you don't, maybe you can get away with it. Maybe it's okay. I don't know. But I just feel more comfortable having a grasp on the professions that I assign my characters and feeling like they know what they're doing, whether or not they ever explain it all to the reader.
Yeah. Well, and I think that now that we live in an age where like sensitivity readers are a thing and we try to make it more sense of like we try to make sure that portraying other cultures are more accurate, portraying other races, whatever, are more
Right.
accurate. I think that applying that same logic to professions makes a lot of sense. Like the reason you talk to experts is because they're people that know that have the information that you want to make sure feel okay about how they're represented in your world. So like I don't think if you're writing about somebody who works in a fast food restaurant, maybe have a conversation with someone who works in a fast food restaurant. It wouldn't kill you. I think that it maybe just taking those extra steps doesn't hurt.
Yeah. So the most recent one, Killer Convergence, that just came out, happens as we're headed into COVID. Only because the rest of the series had some timestamps and some dates and things in them, and because it's a continuous series, that was just when that last book hit. And so one of the things I wanted to know was how did general practitioners handle seeing patients or consulting with patients in that whole pandemic? And so there is a doctor local to me who I know his wife really well. I know him better now. He sat down and had coffee with me one afternoon and explained that going into COVID, there really were not any guidelines of how do we do this. And so, from a practice to practice, they were having to define it for themselves and kind of make up their own standards. And so, he told me how his office did it, which made perfect sense to me. So, that's what Matthew's office did because it made perfect sense to him too. So just things like that. I think if you know about your profession of your characters, it's so much more real.
What have you been a fan of lately? Like, what's the thing you've been consuming, reading, watching? What's the thing you've been into lately?
So I had okay. I had a book on my TBR that I really, that's to like your to be read list for anybody who's not an avid reader listening. Um, James. So this is Percival Everett. I have had this on my to be read list for like a year now, and I really wanted to read this book. What was holding me up is I had not read this one. So this is Huckleberry Finn since I was a child. And I really thought in order to read James that I should read Huckleberry Finn first and, get the original version. It's really not necessary, I'll just tell you. Everett keeps sort of to the same storyline about halfway through the book. Um, his version is so much more readable, especially now because you were, talking about cultures and people groups and stuff. Huckleberry Finn was really hard to read for me now. As a child, I wasn't as tuned in to all of that. And I mean, I remember it having an impression, but not the impression that it had now. So some of it was really hard to read because of the language, against that people group. And some of it was just the stupidity of Tom Sawyer and all the stuff that he goes through when they're rescuing Jim. And just that was a slog. That was work getting through that. And I think as a child, it was more entertaining because it was more fun and the kids were having an adventure. And as an adult,
Yeah.
I'm like, are you kidding me? That's ridiculous. Just get on with it. Um, but I loved James. This is very well written, very well done. It's a whole different take on a classic story that's much more real and relevant, especially to today's audience. Um, some of it you just think, would a slave really ever read and love Voltaire? I mean, I'll confess to you that I've never read Voltaire. I mean, I know about some of the writings just from references, but it's not something that I've just been dying to sit down and read. And yet a slave in here is just intrigued. But he has conversations and dreams with, famous authors and famous thinkers of that day and age that are just intriguing. So that was my most recent read. I'm moving on now to an author who happens to be an entomologist and I just recently learned about him from North Carolina State University, which is my grad school alma mater. And he has a series of mysteries that I'm not sure if the main character is an entomologist. I don't know. I'm getting ready to find out. So that's next on my list. But it's research as well as pleasure.
Yeah, so that's the thing that I try to do. I try to separate my leisure from my because if there's treated as an author, it's hard to consume fiction for fun because you're always looking for things you can incorporate into your stuff, right? Whether you're realizing it or not, you're getting so invested in the storytelling that it's like hard to pull yourself out. So that's sort of what I've been doing lately to relax. The thing I've been a fan of lately is Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order because it's a video game and it sort of like tells the story for you, so you don't have to worry so much about getting invested. You're also playing the game and also like moving around and things. I think that helps me to not get as bogged down in the details. And the truth is, Star Wars is one of those things that every time I take a break and then get back into it, like it's such a rich world that I'm always like happy to fall back into, you know.
Uh, I need to write that one down for my son. It sounds like something, if he doesn't already know about it, he would love it.
It's just a fun adventure playing as a Jedi. You get to play with lightsabers, all the things you like to do in Star Wars.
That
So
sounds like fun. Yeah, I don't know that maybe there are detective games out there. I don't know.
a bonus, non-related one. So there's a game called LA Noir where you play a detective during the Black Dahlia murders, and
Oh.
it is bad. The people who do it's Rockstar Games, people that do the Grand Theft Auto series,
Oh yeah.
and you play like a noir detective that walks around and like gathers evidence and does interviews, and it's really good. So check that out for sure if you're a video game person.
Well, I'm not, but my son is. It's called LA Noir.
Yeah.
Got it.
All right. So, Lee, if anybody would like to find your books, they may have not heard of you yet. Where can they go to find them, and what should they? You said the last book in your series just came out. That's pretty exciting.
It did. The last one just came out this spring. It's called Killer Convergence. They are available everywhere. They're on Amazon, they're Barnes& and Noble, downloadable as ebooks on every platform I know of. My website, though, if you want to go there and just check out the books, check out reviews, check out events and things I have coming up, is cypressrivermedia.com. And I realized after doing some of these podcasts earlier that that was kind of a mouthful and maybe a little bit hard to keep up with. So you can also get there if you type in Lee Clark author. It'll redirect you.
Yeah, these are things we learn as we go, right?
We do. So the publisher is actually Cypress River Media, but because that's a bit of a mouthful and you have to know how to spell Cypress, which some people have come back to me and real it's the tree, Cypress. But the shortcut, the easier way is just to type in Lee Clark author and it'll redirect you to Cypress River Media.
Well, thank you so much, Lee. This has been a delight. It's been so great to have you.
Oh, I enjoyed chatting with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Most Writers Are Fans is a Starlight King production. Special thanks to our guest, Lee Clark. This episode was edited by Bren Russell. You can watch video episodes on YouTube and Spotify and subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss a new conversation about the craft of storytelling. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review the show. It really helps us reach more writers and readers like you. To leave a comment, send a message, or even record a voice note, visit mostwritersareFans.com or email us at press@starlightkingpress.com. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, don't be afraid to tell your story.